That point about the machine running beyond Lucas's control is all too evident when it comes to the second and third films of the prequel trilogy. Lucas spent years working on Episode 1's script, but that wasn't an option now. With him having only an outline to work with, and an incomplete one at that, it was go time almost immediately after Episode 1 hit the theater. And the reaction to that film really bothered Lucas, and he knew he wasn't alone. When the film launched, Lucas personally contacted Ahmed Best to assure him that the backlash would pass, that the Ewoks and even Lando Calrissian had undergone the same thing. He thought that, like those elements of the original trilogy, Jar Jar might one day be accepted, even embraced by fandom. But he knew that in the short term, the last thing the film needed was more Jar Jar, not if the fans despised him. Episode 1 made a lot of money, but not enough for Episode 2 to be a flop. And in that sense, it was probably for the best that Lucas had only completed the script of the first film. Had he done all three at once, it's likely that the much-maligned character would have played a prominent role in at least the second film, with potentially disastrous results. But while it might have averted the problem of Jar Jar, and given Lucas a better sense of what the audience did and didn't like, this would be a real problem for the production. While Lucas spent the next 2 months vacationing in Europe after Episode 1's release, work on Episode 2 back home began the week after it was released. Lucas would begin actually writing the script in September, and with a June schedule for principal photography, he was going to have to work very quickly. But of course, the demands of keeping that machine running were never far away, no matter how much Rick McCallum specifically, and Lucasfilm in general, tried to take the pressure off him so that he could put together a solid script. Lucas was also still dealing with the fallout of his decision to make Episode 1 the story of 9-year-old Anakin. With the necessity to put things into a proper position to pay off for the climax, and with the need to have the story beats in the correct place, he was again stuck with only part of a story, and had to find something else to fill it with. Lucas decided to introduce a major change to his plotline in order to do so. He knew the story would involve the Clone Wars, mentioned in passing back in the original film as a war that Obi-Wan had fought in, but his outline plan for the war allowed room for Lucas to add something new to it. Originally, the Jedi would discover that the Separatist forces had more than just droids. They had been cloning the villainous bounty hunter working for them to create their own army. But with the Jedi's arrival, the army would be seized and instead be put to use fighting against the Separatists instead of for them. Lucas decided that instead, they would be created for the Republic, but in secret. A secret that would be unraveled by Obi-Wan, and thus allow him to fill the gaps in his story with a mystery plot. The original trilogy had never allowed for that kind of thing, but in a situation where the good guys have authority, it was a new opportunity that he was now eager to explore. But while the Clone Wars would prove a major element of Palpatine's plotline and be the action focus for the film, for Anakin this film would be a romance. It had to be, because Padme would play so large a role in his downfall in Episode 3. The original plan was for the wedding to happen relatively early in the second film, but the restructuring of the prequels had made that impossible. Even as seen, it would prove a bit of a whirlwind courtship for the two to marry at the end of the film, but it was the latest possible moment that it could happen. He also decided to go with a more old-fashioned style of romancing, something more in place with the 1930s, when film serials were common. As he explained, he had experience doing love stories from doing American Graffiti, but what he was going for here was something else, which he knew he was taking a chance on. But he felt that, in the more operatic tale that the prequels were now moving towards, it would be better to have a flowery and old-fashioned romance. Further changes also involved the Clone Wars themselves. Originally it was described by official, if never filmed, sources as being an invasion by an army of clones, and would involve shock troops, among whose number was none other than Boba Fett. Fett was working into Lucas's new idea of the Clone Wars as a war that used clones, but there was a problem with that. The film needed to have some kind of bad guy to be taken down here, the same way that Darth Maul had been for the first film, but the story beats didn't allow for Anakin to slay the apprentice of Sidious in this film. Naturally, if Boba Fett is the visible street-level villain involved throughout the film, he could be the one to die. But that introduces an obvious problem. He can't die now. He has to appear in the original trilogy. How are you going to possibly work around that? Are you going to say that the other Boba Fett was his clone? So you can see now how Lucas solved his problem. Boba Fett would have one special clone set aside so that when he dies, that clone would become the Boba Fett that we know. And to avoid confusing the younger members of the audience, he just renamed the older bounty hunter Jango instead. Once again, an idea crystallizes out of the necessity of fitting all of the pieces together to form a single whole. Another rumored change was related to the character of Aura Singh. This character, who was on screen for mere seconds in Episode 1 and initially only added to fill out the pod race with more people, was reportedly mentioned by Lucas to be more important later on. If so, what he likely couldn't have anticipated was that the character would actually be one of the more popular ones despite that cameo. Her presence in spin-off media proved this. According to inside sources, Lucas had planned for her to be the partner that Boba Fett would sacrifice during the mission to assassinate Padme Amidala. But suddenly that didn't seem as good of an idea. Lucas commented that, had he known that Boba Fett would be so popular, he wouldn't have killed the character off in a cheap gag. He possibly wouldn't have killed the character off at all. In fact, he not only approved of the spin-off work declaring that Boba Fett escaped the Sarlacc, he came close to filming it and inserting it into the special edition of Return of the Jedi. He decided the last thing he should do is kill a character popular with the audience. So Aura was replaced with Zam Wesell so that she could snuff it instead. Her death would set the mystery on the path to the planet Kamino, which was one of several that Lucas developed with Lee Brackett during the story conference for Empire Strikes Back, a world composed entirely of oceans. There was also discussion for an alien species on Cloud City called the Whatnots, replaced by the Ugnaughts in the final film. These were described as being similar to the aliens seen in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Lucas decided to bring both back as the setting and architecture for the clone army, but then there was the matter of how to bring about the conflict. Lucas' outline merely said that Sidious put the plot into motion involving a force of separatists, but he was light on details. He also found himself in need of a replacement for Darth Maul, and while he went that direction initially, he soon started looking for other options. The so-called Sith Witch, who would eventually become Asajj Ventress in the spin-off material, was pulled out from Episode 1 production arc as someone to watch over the Separatists on her master's behalf. But after thinking about it, Lucas had a different idea. A cyborg, far more machine-like than Vader had been. But even as they were exploring the options for this character, Lucas hit upon an idea for a completely different direction. He knew there needed to be someone in charge of the Separatists, someone with charisma to serve as a focal point for drawing together these forces. Clearly someone better than the sniveling Newt Gunray of the Trade Federation. Who that would be hadn't really crystallized yet. He knew Sidious would maneuver this person into position, but there was no way that he could do the job himself. If he appeared openly, it could compromise him. So clearly an intermediary was demanded. But then the simplicity hit him. What if that person was the new apprentice? Why not have this one be a stark contrast, a regal presence as opposed to a silent killer? Making this new Sith this way moved the apprentice away from Darth Maul and more towards Darth Vader, who, while a skilled fighter, was a more controlled combatant who operated openly instead of from shadows. Lucas realized the implications of what he could do with that. In Return of the Jedi, the Emperor attempted to turn Luke by getting him to kill Vader, to give in to anger and strike down his enemy. What if he made this new Sith like the way Vader was in that film, and Anakin like the way Luke was in that film, to bring home the significance of Luke's resistance at the end of the original trilogy? Thus, this Count Dooku, aka Darth Tyrannus, would be like Vader, a fallen Jedi, and would likewise be an important figure within the enemy ranks, would be taken in by thoughts of bringing order and stability to a corrupt galactic republic. Thus, when Anakin would strike him down, he was not only foreshadowing the confrontation that he and his son would have in Episode 6, but it also meant that in doing so, Anakin would become the very man he hated. Lucas was happy with this new development and pulled these pieces together to put together several rough drafts before handing it over for a rewrite. The harsh criticisms had left a mark, and Lucas knew this time they needed a writer to work over the material. This time they approached a different young indie alumnus, Jonathan Hales. But while much would be made in the press of someone else being brought in, the reality was Lucas was behind. He had started working 6 days a week, but even then, he turned in the script to Hales the same day that he turned it in to Rick McCallum to prepare for shooting. There was little that Hales could do short of rework some of the dialogue, rather than do a fresh rewrite as Lawrence Kasdan had done with Empire and Jedi. This wasn't because Lucas felt his work was perfect. It was just a matter of time. He was the writer, the director, the executive producer, the owner of the company that bore his name. But he didn't have the power to stop time itself. The machine insisted on grinding on whether George Lucas was ready or not.